A 50-year-old mother from rural Australia served her estranged husband's family a beef Wellington lunch that would become the most notorious meal in the country's criminal history, leaving 3 relatives dead within days and 1 clinging to life in an intensive care unit. But 23 months later, as Justice Christopher Beale delivers his final instructions to a sequestered jury in the regional town of Morwell, shocking new revelations about deleted phone evidence and deliberate deception have emerged that could determine whether this was cold-blooded murder or a tragic accident that destroyed an entire family. The courtroom falls silent as the judge outlines what prosecutors call incriminating conduct that paints a devastating picture of calculated lies, destroyed evidence, and desperate cover-up attempts. But defense lawyers argue that grief, panic, and human error explain the seemingly suspicious behavior that has captivated Australia for nearly 2 years. What started as a family reconciliation lunch on July 29, 2023, in the small Victorian town of Leongatha, has become one of the most complex murder trials in Australian history. 3 people are dead from death-cap mushroom poisoning. 1 man survived against impossible odds. And now, 12 jurors must decide if ERIN Patterson deliberately used the world's most toxic fungus as a weapon, or if she is the victim of an unthinkable coincidence that cost her the love and trust of everyone she held dear. The evidence that has emerged during 8 weeks of testimony reads like something from a crime thriller. Secret internet searches for deadly mushrooms. A food dehydrator mysteriously disposed of at the local tip. Multiple phone factory resets in the days following the deaths. Conflicting stories about where she bought the ingredients. And through it all, the haunting question that has gripped a nation: how does a family lunch turn into a triple homicide? But this is not just another murder trial. This is a story about survival against impossible odds, about the fragility of family relationships, and about how quickly love can turn to suspicion when tragedy strikes. It is the story of Ian Wilkinson, the 71-year-old pastor who stared death in the face and lived to tell about it. It is the story of a community torn apart by accusations and grief, and it is the story of how one meal changed everything for everyone involved. As we sit here in June 2025, waiting for a verdict that could send ERIN Patterson to prison for life or clear her name forever, the dramatic developments of recent days have added new layers to an already complex case. The judge's warning to jurors not to convict based solely on lies, combined with his detailed outline of allegedly incriminating behavior, represents a critical moment in a trial that has held Australia spellbound. The rolling hills of South Gippsland in Victoria painted a deceptively peaceful backdrop for what would become one of Australia's most infamous family gatherings. Leongatha, a farming community of barely 4,000 residents, was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbours and family disputes were usually settled over Sunday dinner, not in courtrooms. But on the morning of July 29, 2023, as ERIN Patterson prepared what she hoped would be a reconciliation meal, the foundations of trust that held this rural community together were about to be shattered forever. The kitchen of her modest home on Dean Avenue filled with the rich aromas of garlic, shallots, and herbs as she meticulously crafted individual beef Wellington portions for her guests. This was not just any meal, it was her first attempt at the sophisticated dish her mother used to prepare for special occasions. Patterson had spent considerable time planning this lunch, hoping to mend fractured relationships with her estranged husband's family. The guest list told the story of a family struggling to stay connected despite growing tensions. Don Patterson, 70, and his wife Gail, also 70, were ERIN's former in-laws and the grandparents of her 2 children. Don had worked as a tradesman his entire life, building a reputation for reliability and straight-talking in the close-knit farming community. Gail was known for her gentle nature and dedication to her grandchildren, often stepping in to help with childcare when ERIN needed support. Joining them would be Gail's sister, Heather Wilkinson, 66, and her husband Ian, 71. Ian served as pastor of the local Baptist church, a position he had held with quiet dignity for years. The Wilkinsons were respected pillars of the community, known for their charitable work and open-door policy for anyone in need. Heather shared her sister's caring nature, and both women had tried to maintain family unity despite the growing problems in ERIN and Simon's marriage. The invitation had come as a surprise to all 4 guests. Family gatherings had become increasingly strained as ERIN's relationship with her husband Simon deteriorated over financial pressures and disagreements about their children's education. Simon had been living elsewhere for some time, and the extended family found themselves walking on eggshells, trying to maintain relationships with both sides while avoiding taking positions in the marital conflict. The irony was not lost on anyone that Simon himself had been invited to this reconciliation lunch, but had pulled out at the last minute. His text message to ERIN the night before the gathering was brief but telling. He felt too uncomfortable to attend. The rejection stung ERIN, who had specifically planned this meal as an olive branch to the family she feared losing in the divorce proceedings. "I was a bit hurt and a bit stressed," ERIN would later testify about Simon's withdrawal. She had been feeling increasingly isolated from family gatherings and wanted to make more of an effort to stay connected. The beef Wellington represented more than just food. It was her attempt to show that she valued these relationships and wanted to preserve them despite the marital breakdown. The preparation was meticulous. ERIN had never made beef Wellington before, but she was determined to get it right. She started early in the morning, following recipes she had researched online. The mushroom duxelles, a finely chopped mixture that would coat the beef before wrapping in pastry, required careful attention. She sautéed store-bought button mushrooms with garlic and shallots, simmering the mixture on low heat for 45 minutes until it reached the perfect consistency. According to her testimony, she made one large batch of the mushroom mixture, enough for all 5 planned servings. The prosecution would later argue that she prepared separate, poisoned portions for her guests while reserving a safe serving for herself. But ERIN maintained throughout the trial that she prepared everything together, intending to share the same meal with her family. When the guests arrived around midday, the atmosphere was cautiously optimistic. Ian Wilkinson later testified that he had been very happy to accept the invitation, despite being surprised by it. The relationships were friendly and amicable, though he considered ERIN more of an acquaintance than a close friend. The COVID-19 pandemic had actually brought them closer together when ERIN helped broadcast his church services on YouTube, and she attended his sermons intermittently. The conversation during the meal was pleasant but carried undertones of the family tensions everyone was trying to navigate. The beef Wellington was well received, served alongside green beans and mashed potatoes. It seemed like the reconciliation lunch was achieving its intended purpose, bringing the family together despite the difficult circumstances. But it was what happened after the meal that would forever change everything. As the dishes were being cleared and the conversation continued, ERIN made an announcement that stunned her guests into silence. She revealed that she had cancer, a serious, life-threatening diagnosis that she was struggling to understand and cope with. The revelation cast the entire lunch in a different light. Suddenly, the invitation made sense. This was not just about mending relationships. It was about a frightened woman reaching out to her family for support during a medical crisis. The guests immediately rallied around her, offering advice and comfort. Ian Wilkinson, drawing on his pastoral experience, suggested honesty as the best approach when telling her children about the diagnosis. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes before being interrupted by the return of ERIN's children from their activities. Recognizing the sensitivity of the discussion, Ian suggested they close with a prayer. "I prayed a prayer asking God's blessing on ERIN, that she would get the treatment that she needed, that the kids would be okay, that she would have wisdom in how she told the kids," Ian would later recall from the witness stand. What none of the guests knew, as they shared that moment of prayer and fellowship, was that ERIN Patterson had never been diagnosed with cancer. The emotional confession that had moved them to offer support and prayer was completely fabricated. More disturbing still, prosecutor Nanette Rogers would later argue in court that ERIN never expected to have to account for this lie, because she believed her lunch guests would be dead within days. The tragic irony of that prayer, asking for God's protection over someone who may have just poisoned them, would haunt the survivors and the community for years to come. As the guests said their goodbyes and headed home, carrying containers of leftover beef Wellington, none of them could have imagined that they had just consumed what prosecutors would later call premeditated murder, disguised as family hospitality. Within hours, the first symptoms would begin. Within days, 3 of the 4 guests would be dead, and the quiet farming community of Leongatha would never be the same again. The horror began quietly, as most medical emergencies do, with seemingly innocent complaints that quickly escalated into a nightmare no family should endure. By Saturday evening, just hours after the lunch that was supposed to heal family divisions, all 4 guests were experiencing the first signs that something was terribly wrong. Don Patterson was the first to recognize the severity of their situation. The 70-year-old tradesman had built his reputation on being tough and self-reliant, the kind of man who worked through minor illnesses and never complained. But by 8 o'clock that evening, he had suffered 30 to 40 episodes of violent vomiting and diarrhea. This was not food poisoning from undercooked meat or a stomach bug. this was something far more dangerous. His wife Gail, despite her own mounting distress, tried to care for her husband while battling her own symptoms. The couple had been married for decades, partners through all of life's challenges, but nothing had prepared them for this. As the night wore on, both became unable to tolerate fluids, a dangerous sign that their bodies were shutting down at the cellular level. Across town, Heather and Ian Wilkinson were experiencing identical symptoms. Heather, 66, had always been the picture of health, active in church and community activities despite her age. Now she found herself doubled over in agony, her body rejecting everything she tried to consume. Ian, the pastor who had offered the closing prayer at lunch just hours earlier, watched helplessly as his wife suffered through what they both initially assumed was severe food poisoning. The medical crisis that unfolded over the next 24 hours would test every resource of the rural Australian healthcare system. By Sunday morning, all 4 victims were in such distress that family members drove them to the local hospital. What they found there would begin to reveal the true scope of the tragedy they were facing. Dr. Stephen Walkhill, director of Austin Health's intensive care unit, would later describe the medical emergency as one of the most challenging cases of his career. Death cap mushroom poisoning is rare in Australia, and many medical professionals never encounter it in their entire careers. The toxins contained in these fungi attack the body at the cellular level, stopping protein production in liver cells and causing them to die en masse. Once the Amanite poison is within the body, unfortunately the body tends to recycle it internally. Dr. Warrilow explained to the court. This internal recycling makes the poisoning particularly deadly. The body cannot eliminate the toxins fast enough to prevent organ failure, and the damage compounds over time. By Monday morning, the condition of all 4 patients had deteriorated so rapidly that doctors arranged emergency transfers to Austin Hospital in Melbourne, a major facility with specialized liver care capabilities. The small regional hospital in Corumburra simply did not have the resources to handle multiple cases of severe organ failure. The next few days became a desperate race against time. Advanced life support systems were the only thing standing between the victims and death as their organs began shutting down one by one. The families gathered in hospital waiting rooms, clinging to hope while doctors worked around the clock to save their loved ones. Gail Patterson, described by everyone who knew her as a devoted grandmother and caring woman, fought bravely against the toxins ravaging her system. At 70, her body lacked the resilience to combat the massive organ failure that death cap poisoning inflicts. Her liver, kidneys, and other vital organs were failing simultaneously, and despite the best efforts of the medical team, she was considered too weak for a liver transplant, the only intervention that might have saved her life. On August 4, 2023, 6 days after the lunch that was meant to bring the family together, Gail Patterson died from multiple organ failure caused by mushroom poisoning. Her death certificate would list acute liver necrosis as the immediate cause, but the real cause was the toxic meal she had consumed while trying to support a family member she believed was facing cancer. Her sister Heather Wilkinson followed the same tragic path. At 66, she had years of active life ahead of her, grandchildren to spoil, and community work she was passionate about. But the death cap toxins showed no mercy for her plans or dreams. Like her sister, she was too weak for the liver transplant that might have been her only chance at survival. Heather died on the same day as Gail, August 4th, her husband Ian keeping vigil at her bedside as the medical team fought a losing battle against the poison in her system. The woman who had shared countless family gatherings, who had tried to maintain peace during the marital difficulties between Erin and Simon, became the second victim of what prosecutors would later argue was a carefully planned murder disguised as family hospitality. Don Patterson's death was perhaps the most heartbreaking because it came so close to potential salvation. The tough old tradesman had been selected for an emergency liver transplant, a procedure that offered genuine hope for survival. His family gathered at the hospital as surgeons prepared for the complex operation that might save his life. The transplant surgery was successful from a technical standpoint. Don received a healthy liver that should have given him years of additional life, but the death cap toxins had already caused too much damage to other organs. His kidneys, heart, and other systems had been too severely compromised by days of poison circulating through his bloodstream. On August 5, 2023, just 1 day after receiving his new liver, Don Patterson died from complications related to multiple organ failure. The grandfather who had offered advice about honesty and family communication during what he thought was a cancer consultation became the third and final fatality from the lunch that shocked Australia. 3 deaths in 3 days. 3 funerals for people who had simply accepted an invitation to lunch from a family member they trusted. 3 graves in the Korumburra General Cemetery that would become a shrine for a community struggling to understand how such tragedy could strike their quiet corner of the world. But there was one survivor, and his story would become central to both the criminal case and the healing process that followed. ERIN Wilkinson, the 71-year-old pastor who had offered the closing prayer over a woman he believed was facing cancer, found himself fighting for his own life in ways that would test every aspect of his faith. The medical team initially expected him to follow the same tragic path as his wife and the Patterson couple. His organs were failing, his body was shutting down, and the death cap toxins continued their relentless assault on his system. "We thought he was going to die," Dr. Warrillow testified. "He was very close." For weeks, ERIN remained in an induced coma on life support while doctors battled to keep him alive. His children and grandchildren maintained constant vigils, praying for the miracle that seemed increasingly unlikely with each passing day. The same man who had comforted countless families through their darkest hours now needed that comfort himself. But ERIN Wilkinson proved that sometimes faith, medical expertise, and human determination can overcome even the deadliest toxins. Slowly, gradually, against all expectations, he began to respond to treatment. His liver, though severely damaged, retained enough function to allow his body to begin the long process of recovery. In September 2023, nearly 2 months after consuming the meal that killed his wife and 2 close friends, ERIN Wilkinson was discharged from Austin Hospital. He was weak, traumatized, and facing a future without his beloved wife, but he was alive. His survival would prove crucial not only to the criminal prosecution, but to a community desperate for some sign that good could emerge from such devastating tragedy. The 4 empty chairs at future family gatherings would serve as permanent reminders of the lunch that changed everything. But ERIN Wilkinson's survival would also remind everyone that even in the darkest circumstances, hope and healing remain possible for those strong enough to fight for them. The call came into Victoria Police at 11:37 a.m. on August 1st, 2023, from Austin Hospital in Melbourne. 3 patients were dead or dying from suspected mushroom poisoning, and a 4th was fighting for his life. What started as a medical emergency was about to become one of Australia's most complex criminal investigations. Detective Inspector Dean Thomas of the Homicide Squad found himself facing a case unlike anything in his 20-year career. Mushroom poisoning deaths were rare enough that most investigators never encountered them, but 3 deaths from the same meal, with 1 survivor clinging to life, immediately raised red flags that transformed a tragic accident investigation into a potential triple homicide inquiry. The first challenge was understanding the poison itself. Death cap mushrooms, known scientifically as Amanita phalloides, contain some of the most potent toxins found in nature. Unlike other poisonous substances that cause immediate symptoms, death cap toxins create a delayed reaction that makes them particularly insidious. Victims often feel fine for hours or even days after consumption, only to experience sudden catastrophic organ failure once the toxins have circulated throughout their systems. This delayed onset meant that by the time symptoms appeared, it was often too late for effective treatment. The fact that all 4 victims had consumed the same meal on July 29th, but did not seek medical attention until July 30th, gave the toxins crucial extra time to cause irreversible damage. The investigation team immediately focused on the source of the mushrooms. If this was accidental poisoning, they needed to identify where the death caps had been purchased or foraged to prevent other potential victims. If it was intentional, they needed to understand how the perpetrator had obtained and prepared such deadly fungi. ERIN Patterson's initial cooperation with police seemed to support the accidental poisoning theory. She voluntarily provided information about the ingredients she had used, claiming she had purchased dried mushrooms from an Asian grocery store in Melbourne. She also presented herself at Leongatha Hospital on July 31st, reporting symptoms consistent with death cap poisoning. But even in those first days, inconsistencies began to emerge that troubled investigators. ERIN's medical presentation at the hospital did not match the severe symptoms experienced by her guests. While Don, Gail, Heather, and Ian were suffering massive organ failure requiring life support, ERIN appeared relatively well to medical staff. One doctor noted that she did not look unwell when being treated, and ambulance paramedics observed that she seemed fine during transport. More concerning was her behavior regarding medical treatment. Despite claiming to have consumed the same meal that was killing her guests, ERIN initially refused to be admitted to the hospital. She left against medical advice after her first presentation, saying she needed to care for her children and animals at home. When she returned for a second visit, she remained reluctant to receive treatment and had to be convinced by medical staff to stay for observation. The forensic investigation of her home on Dean Avenue revealed additional puzzling elements. On August 2nd, just 3 days after the fatal lunch, and while her former in-laws were dying in intensive care, ERIN had disposed of a food dehydrator at the local tip. When questioned about this timing, she claimed it was routine household decluttering, but investigators found the coincidence suspicious. Digital forensics would later reveal that ERIN had also performed multiple factory resets on her mobile phone in the days immediately following the deaths. These resets permanently deleted text messages, photos, internet search history, and other data that might have provided crucial evidence about her state of mind and activities leading up to the lunch. The phone evidence became particularly significant when investigators discovered that ERIN had provided police with a secondary device during their search of her home on August 5th, rather than her primary phone, which was never recovered. She had misled officers about her phone number and claimed the secondary device was her main phone, a deception that would later be identified as one of several alleged lies she told during the early stages of the investigation. As the investigation expanded, detectives began examining ERIN's internet search history from devices they were able to recover. What they found painted a disturbing picture of someone who had researched death cap mushrooms extensively in the months leading up to the fatal lunch. Records showed that someone using ERIN's computer had visited the iNaturalist website, a citizen science platform where people upload photos and locations of plants and fungi they encounter in nature. The visits coincided with postings by other users documenting death cap mushroom sightings in areas within driving distance of ERIN's home. On April 18, 2023, retired poison information specialist Christine McKenzie had posted photos of death cap mushrooms she had found in Locke, about 28 kilometers from Leongatha. Cell phone tower data suggested that ERIN's phone had been in the Locke area on April 28, just 10 days after McKenzie's posting. Within 2 hours of this alleged visit, store records showed that ERIN had purchased a food dehydrator from a local retailer. A similar pattern emerged with another death cap sighting posted by mycologist Tom May on May 21st in Outram, about 19 kilometers from ERIN's home. Phone records indicated ERIN's device had been in the Outram region on May 22nd, the day after May's posting. The prosecution would later argue that these internet searches and location data showed premeditation, that ERIN had researched where to find death cap mushrooms, visited those locations to harvest them, and then used the dehydrator to preserve them for later use in her deadly lunch. The defense would counter that the phone data could be explained by normal travel patterns, and that the internet searches reflected innocent curiosity about local fungi. The community reaction to the investigation was immediate and intense. News of the mushroom poisoning deaths spread quickly through the tight-knit farming region where everyone seemed to know everyone else. The fact that a family lunch had turned into a potential triple murder shattered the sense of safety that had always defined rural life in South Gippsland. Local businesses found themselves drawn into the investigation as police worked to verify ERIN's claims about where she had purchased ingredients. Her story about buying dried mushrooms from an Asian grocery store in Melbourne's eastern suburbs became a crucial element of the case, but investigators struggled to find any store that matched her descriptions or had records of such a purchase. The inconsistencies in her account were striking. At different times, she claimed to have bought the mushrooms in Oakley, Glen Waverley, and Mount Waverley, 3 different Melbourne suburbs. She provided detailed descriptions of other aspects of her shopping trips, but claimed to have no memory of which specific store had sold her the potentially deadly fungi. Prosecutors would later argue that this selective memory beggared belief, that someone who could remember detailed conversations and minor shopping details would forget the source of ingredients that had killed 3 people. The defense would respond that human memory is fallible under stress and that investigators had failed to adequately search the Asian grocery stores in the areas ERIN had mentioned. As weeks turned to months, the investigation team assembled a complex web of evidence spanning digital forensics, toxicology, cell phone data, witness interviews, and financial records. Every aspect of ERIN Patterson's life in the months leading up to the fatal lunch was scrutinized for signs of planning, motive, or intent. The case was unprecedented in Australian legal history. While poisoning cases were not unknown, the use of wild mushrooms as a murder weapon was virtually unheard of. The delayed onset of symptoms, the difficulty in detecting the toxins, and the readily available source material made death cap mushrooms an almost perfect poison if someone was callous enough to use them against family members. On November 2, 2023, After months of investigation and consultation with prosecutors, Victoria Police arrested ERIN Patterson at her Leongatha home. The charges were as serious as they were shocking: 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. If convicted, she would face life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community that had watched the investigation unfold with growing horror and fascination. The woman who had cooked what she claimed was a reconciliation lunch for her estranged husband's family was now accused of using that meal to commit premeditated murder. But the arrest was only the beginning. The case would now move into the courtroom, where prosecutors would have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that ERIN Patterson had deliberately poisoned her guests. The defense would argue that this was a tragic accident compounded by panic, poor judgment, and the natural human tendency to make bad decisions under extreme stress. The investigation had provided the framework for the prosecution case, but it would be up to a jury to decide whether the evidence proved murder or simply demonstrated how quickly tragedy can destroy lives and families when suspicion replaces trust. The digital age has made it nearly impossible to commit the perfect crime, and ERIN Patterson's case would prove that even deleted evidence can tell a compelling story. As forensic investigators dove deeper into her electronic devices and communication patterns, they uncovered a trail of digital breadcrumbs that the prosecution would argue revealed careful planning and deliberate deception. The most damning evidence came from her mobile phone usage patterns in the weeks and months before the fatal lunch. Like most people, ERIN had her phone with her constantly, creating an electronic record of her movements, communications, and internet activities that would become crucial to understanding her state of mind and intentions. Detective Senior Constable Bradley Fox Henry, a digital forensics specialist with Victoria Police, spent months analyzing the devices seized from ERIN's home. His expertise in recovering deleted data and tracking digital footprints would prove essential to the prosecution case, though his qualifications and methods would come under intense scrutiny from the defense. The most significant discovery was a pattern of factory resets performed on what investigators labeled Phone B, a secondary device that ERIN had provided to police instead of her primary phone during their search of her home. These resets, which permanently destroy all data on a device, occurred at specific times that prosecutors argued showed consciousness of guilt. The first reset had occurred on February 12, 2023, at 3:53 a.m., an unusual time for routine phone maintenance. But it was the resets after the fatal lunch that drew the most attention from investigators. On August 2, 2023, at 9:09 p.m., someone performed a factory reset on Phone B. This was the same day ERIN had disposed of her food dehydrator at the local tip, just 4 days after the lunch that killed 3 people. Even more suspicious was the timing of subsequent resets. On August 5, at 11:20 p.m., another factory reset was performed. This time while Phone B was already in police custody after being seized during the search of ERIN's home. The following day, August 6, at 3:16 p.m., yet another reset was executed while the device remained with investigators. Fox Henry testified that the first 3 resets were performed locally, meaning someone with physical possession of the phone had initiated them. The destruction of evidence while the device was supposed to be preserved for forensic analysis suggested either deliberate tampering or security protocols that automatically deleted data to prevent unauthorized access. The prosecution argued that these resets showed ERIN's desperate attempts to hide evidence of her planning and intentions. The defense countered that modern smartphones regularly perform automatic updates and security protocols that can trigger factory resets, especially when passwords are forgotten or devices are handled by people unfamiliar with their security settings. But the phone resets were only part of the digital evidence that troubled investigators. Analysis of ERIN's internet search history revealed a disturbing pattern of research into death-cap mushrooms and their locations in Victoria. The searches began months before the fatal lunch, suggesting long-term planning rather than spontaneous action. The key evidence came from visits to iNaturalist, a citizen science website where amateur botanists and mycologists share photos and locations of plants and fungi they encounter in nature. 2 specific postings would become central to the prosecution case against ERIN Patterson. On April 18, 2023, Christine McKenzie, a retired poison information specialist, had uploaded photos of death-cap mushrooms she had found near Loch, about 28 kilometers from ERIN's home. Mackenzie had been walking with her husband, grandson, and dog when she spotted the deadly fungi growing near oak trees, the preferred habitat for death-cap mushrooms. Recognizing the danger these mushrooms posed to pets and curious children, Mackenzie had carefully disposed of them but uploaded the photos to iNaturalist with precise GPS coordinates to warn other users about the location. She had no way of knowing that her public service announcement might have provided a treasure map for someone seeking deadly mushrooms. Cell phone tower data, analyzed by telecommunications expert Dr. Nicholas Sorrell, showed that a device associated with ERIN Patterson had connected to towers in the Lock area on April 28, 2023, just 10 days after Mackenzie's warning post. The prosecution argued that ERIN had seen the iNaturalist posting and used it to locate and harvest deathcap mushrooms for later use. Supporting this theory was ERIN's purchase of a food dehydrator on the same day her phone appeared in the Lock area. Store records from a local retailer showed she had bought the device within 2 hours of the alleged mushroom foraging trip. The prosecution argued that this timing was too coincidental to be explained by chance. She had purchased equipment to preserve the deadly fungi she had just collected. A similar pattern emerged with a second iNaturalist posting. On May 21, 2023, expert mycologist Tom May had uploaded photos of deathcap mushrooms he had found near Outram, about 19 kilometers from Leongatha. May's posting included precise latitude and longitude coordinates, making it easy for anyone to locate the exact spot where the mushrooms were growing. Phone records indicated that ERIN's device had been in the Outram region on May 22, the day after May's posting. Again, the prosecution argued that she had used the citizen science platform to locate and harvest deadly mushrooms, building up a supply that would later be used in her fatal lunch preparation. The defense challenged this interpretation of the phone data, arguing that the analysis was too imprecise to prove ERIN had actually visited the mushroom locations. They pointed out that cell phone signals can connect to towers many kilometers away, and that the data was consistent with normal travel patterns in the region. Rural residents routinely drive between small towns for shopping, work, and social activities, making it entirely possible that ERIN's phone had connected to distant towers during innocent trips. More troubling for the defense was evidence that ERIN had accessed iNaturalist directly, not just coincidentally been in areas where mushrooms were posted. Computer forensics revealed that someone using her home computer had visited the website on May 28, 2022, more than a year before the fatal lunch. This earlier visit suggested a long-standing interest in the platform and its mushroom-related content. During cross-examination, Fox Henry acknowledged that he could not definitively prove who had performed the internet searches or visited the mushroom locations. Modern households typically have multiple family members using shared computers and devices, making it difficult to attribute specific activities to individual users without additional evidence. The defense also questioned Fox Henry's qualifications and training in digital forensics. They revealed that at the time he examined ERIN's devices in August 2023, he did not hold some of the certifications he possessed by the time of the trial. His training in data collection had come primarily from on-the-job experience rather than formal coursework, and he had followed instructions from more experienced colleagues rather than developing independent expertise. Despite these challenges to the digital evidence, prosecutors argued that the overall pattern was too consistent to be explained by coincidence. The combination of internet searches, location data, equipment purchases, and subsequent data destruction painted a picture of someone who had carefully planned and executed a sophisticated poisoning scheme. The prosecution also highlighted ERIN's behavior regarding her devices during the police investigation. When officers searched her home on August 5, 2023, she had provided them with phone B rather than her primary device, which was never recovered. She had initially lied about her phone number, claiming that phone B was her main device when phone company records showed she primarily used a different number associated with the missing phone A. This deception extended to her formal police interview on August 5, where she made several statements that investigators later determined to be false. She denied ever foraging for mushrooms, claimed never to have dehydrated food, and stated she had never owned a dehydrator. All of these claims would later be contradicted by evidence, including photos found on her own devices showing mushrooms on dehydrator trays. The lies were not limited to equipment and activities. When asked about her internet search history, ERIN claimed to have no memory of visiting iNaturalist or researching deathcap mushrooms. She acknowledged that the searches could have been performed by her, but insisted she had no idea she had any interest in deadly fungi, beyond general curiosity about what grew in her local area. The prosecution argued that these lies showed consciousness of guilt, that ERIN was trying to distance herself from evidence that proved premeditation. The defense responded that frightened people often lie to police, especially when they fear being blamed for tragic accidents they did not intend to cause. The digital evidence became even more complicated when investigators discovered images on ERIN's seized tablet showing mushrooms on scales and dehydrator trays. Fox Henry testified that he could not determine when these photos were taken, what device originally captured them, or whether they showed death cap mushrooms specifically. The images could have been received from other people rather than taken by ERIN herself. Some of the same devices also contained images and information about ovarian cancer, supporting ERIN's claim that she had been researching medical procedures and treatments. This evidence aligned with her explanation for the cancer announcement she had made during the fatal lunch, though prosecutors noted that she had never actually been diagnosed with cancer or scheduled for treatment. The digital forensics investigation revealed the complexity of modern criminal cases, where electronic evidence can provide crucial insights into intent and planning, but can also be ambiguous and open to multiple interpretations. Every internet search, location ping, and deleted file became part of a larger puzzle that prosecutors and defense attorneys would interpret very differently. The question facing the jury would be whether the digital evidence proved careful planning for murder or simply reflected the normal electronic footprint of someone living in the 21st century. In an age where people carry powerful computers in their pockets and leave digital traces of every activity, the challenge for the legal system is distinguishing between correlation and causation, between suspicious patterns and innocent coincidences. The prosecution would argue that the combination of mushroom research, location visits, equipment purchases, and data destruction showed clear premeditation. The defense would maintain that grieving people make poor decisions under stress, and that the digital evidence could be explained by panic, confusion, and the natural human tendency to delete embarrassing or potentially incriminating information, even when innocent. Ultimately, the digital footprints would become just one element in a complex case where technology intersected with human psychology, family relationships, and the ancient crime of poisoning in ways that would challenge every assumption about modern criminal investigation. The identification of death cap mushrooms as the murder weapon opened a new chapter in the investigation that would take detectives into the specialized world of mycology, toxicology, and the dangerous fungi that flourish in Victoria's forests and parks. Understanding how these deadly organisms could be obtained, prepared, and used as poison became crucial to determining whether the fatal lunch represented premeditated murder or tragic accident. Death cap mushrooms, scientifically known as Amanita phalloides, are not native to Australia. These European imports arrived accidentally, likely attached to the roots of oak trees planted by early colonists, who wanted to recreate the familiar landscapes of their homeland. Over more than a century, the fungi established themselves in parks and gardens throughout southeastern Australia, creating what mycologist Tom May described as time bombs hidden in plain sight. The mushrooms are particularly insidious because they look relatively harmless to untrained eyes. Unlike the bright red toadstools with white spots that appear in fairy tale illustrations of poisonous fungi, death caps are usually pale brown or white, with unremarkable features that could easily be mistaken for edible varieties by inexperienced foragers. But their appearance belies their lethal nature. A single death cap mushroom contains enough toxins to kill an adult human. The primary poisons, amatoxins and phallotoxins, attack the liver and kidneys at the cellular level, causing organ failure that is often irreversible once symptoms appear. What makes them particularly dangerous is that cooking, drying, or other preparation methods do not neutralize the toxins, meaning they remain deadly regardless of how they are processed. Dr. May, a senior mycologist with the Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria, became a key witness in explaining how death cap mushrooms grow, spread, and can be identified in the wild. His expertise would prove crucial to understanding the prosecution's theory that ERIN Patterson had deliberately harvested these fungi for use in her fatal lunch. According to May's testimony, death cap mushrooms in Victoria typically appear above ground for only brief periods, usually in April and May during the autumn season. They grow in association with oak trees, forming underground networks that can persist for decades while only occasionally producing visible mushrooms. This narrow window of availability meant that anyone seeking to harvest them would need to know when and where to look, knowledge that required either experience or research. The prosecution argued that ERIN had conducted exactly this type of research through her visits to the iNaturalist website, where citizen scientists document their encounters with various species. The platform serves as an invaluable resource for botanists, mycologists, and nature enthusiasts, but it could also function as a guide for someone seeking specific organisms for harmful purposes. Christine Mackenzie, the retired poison information specialist who had posted the lock location, testified about her discovery with obvious regret. She had uploaded the photos and GPS coordinates as a public service, hoping to warn dog walkers, families, and other visitors about the deadly fungi growing in a popular recreation area. She had carefully disposed of the mushrooms she found, but acknowledged that more could easily grow in the same location. "I had no idea that someone might use my posting to find the mushrooms for harmful purposes," Mackenzie testified. "I was just trying to keep people and pets safe." The timing of Mackenzie's post and ERIN's alleged visit to the lock area became a crucial element of the prosecution case. Cell phone data placed ERIN's device in the region just 10 days after the iNaturalist posting, and she had purchased a food dehydrator within hours of this trip. Prosecutors argued that this sequence showed clear planning and intent. May's posting from Outram followed a similar pattern. The mycologist had discovered death caps growing near the small town and uploaded precise coordinates to help other researchers and safety officials. Phone records suggested ERIN's device had been in the Outram area the day after May's posting, again suggesting she was using the citizen science platform to locate deadly mushrooms. The defense challenged this interpretation, arguing that correlation was not causation. Rural residents regularly travel between small towns for work, shopping, and social activities. The fact that ERIN's phone had connected to cell towers near mushroom sighting locations could be entirely coincidental, especially given the imprecise nature of cell tower data in sparsely populated areas. More problematic for the prosecution was their inability to find physical evidence that ERIN had actually harvested death cap mushrooms. Despite extensive searches of her property and belongings, investigators never recovered any specimens of the deadly fungi. The food dehydrator that might have contained traces of the mushrooms had been disposed of at the local tip before police knew to look for it. The prosecution argued that this absence of physical evidence actually supported their case, showing that ERIN had carefully planned the poisoning and eliminated potential evidence. The defense countered that you cannot prove someone possessed something by demonstrating its absence. The lack of mushrooms could just as easily support the theory that she had never harvested them at all. The question of how death cap mushrooms had ended up in the beef Wellington became central to both prosecution and defense strategies. Prosecutor Nanette Rogers argued that ERIN had deliberately harvested, dried, and incorporated the deadly fungi into the mushroom duct cells that coated the beef. This required careful planning, specific knowledge about mushroom identification and preservation, and the calculated decision to disguise poison as food. Defense attorney Colin Mandy offered an alternative explanation that would become the foundation of their case. He argued that ERIN had accidentally mixed death cap mushrooms with edible varieties during foraging expeditions, then used the contaminated mixture in her lunch preparation without realizing the danger. This theory suggested tragic accident rather than premeditated murder. The accident theory faced significant challenges from the prosecution, who pointed out that death cap mushrooms do not typically grow in the same locations as edible varieties that ERIN might have been seeking. May testified that the fungi prefer specific soil conditions and tree associations that rarely overlap with habitats for common edible mushrooms like field mushrooms or oyster mushrooms. More damaging to the defense was evidence about ERIN's claimed source for the mushrooms. Throughout the investigation and trial, she maintained that she had used dried mushrooms purchased from an Asian grocery store in Melbourne's eastern suburbs. She provided detailed descriptions of other shopping activities during these trips, but claimed to have no specific memory of which store had sold her the potentially deadly ingredients. The prosecution invested considerable resources in attempting to verify this claim, sending investigators to dozens of Asian grocery stores in the areas ERIN had mentioned. They spoke with shop owners, examined inventory records, and looked for any evidence that death cap mushrooms were being sold as food ingredients. Their searches came up empty. No store reported selling dried mushrooms that matched ERIN's descriptions, and many owners expressed horror at the suggestion that deadly fungi might be sold as food. This failure to locate the alleged source became a cornerstone of the prosecution argument. Rogers argued that the Asian grocery store story was fabricated to provide cover for the real source of the mushrooms, ERIN's own foraging activities guided by iNaturalist postings and enabled by her purchase of food dehydration equipment. The defense criticized investigators for not conducting thorough enough searches of Asian grocery stores, arguing that the prosecution's failure to find the source did not prove it did not exist. They pointed out that many small ethnic grocery stores operate with minimal record-keeping and high inventory turnover, making it difficult to trace specific purchases months after the fact. The mushroom trail also led investigators to examine ERIN's knowledge of fungi and foraging. During police interviews, she claimed to have started mushroom foraging during the COVID-19 pandemic, as a family activity during long walks in the countryside. She described this as innocent recreation rather than systematic harvesting for consumption or other purposes. But evidence from her devices suggested a more sophisticated understanding of mushroom identification and preparation. Photos found on her tablet showed fungi on scales and in dehydrator trays, suggesting she was not just casually picking mushrooms during walks, but carefully processing them for preservation and later use. The prosecution argued that this level of preparation and knowledge was inconsistent with casual foraging. Someone who weighed mushrooms and used dehydration equipment was treating the activity seriously, not as occasional family entertainment. This suggested the kind of systematic approach that could lead to harvesting deadly varieties for specific purposes. Expert testimony revealed the sophisticated nature of death cap mushroom poisoning as a murder method. Unlike other poisons that cause immediate symptoms, amatoxins create a deadly delay that makes both detection and treatment extremely difficult. Victims often feel fine for hours or days after consumption, allowing the toxins to circulate throughout their systems and cause irreversible damage before medical intervention becomes possible. This delayed action makes death cap mushrooms nearly perfect for someone seeking to poison others while avoiding immediate suspicion. The perpetrator could serve the contaminated meal, express concern when guests became ill, and even seek medical attention themselves to maintain the appearance of shared victimhood. Dr. Stephen Warrilow, the intensive care specialist who treated all 4 victims, explained how the toxins work at the cellular level. Amatoxins inhibit RNA polymerase, stopping protein synthesis in liver cells and causing massive cell death. The body's attempts to eliminate the toxins actually recycle them through the liver and kidneys, compounding the damage and making recovery increasingly unlikely. Once the poison is in the system, the body essentially becomes its own worst enemy, Warrilow testified. The normal detoxification processes actually spread the toxins more widely and cause additional damage. This understanding of the poisoning mechanism supported the prosecution argument that someone familiar with death cap mushrooms would know they were choosing an almost certainly fatal weapon. The defense maintained that this same delayed action could explain why someone might accidentally use contaminated mushrooms without realizing the consequences until it was too late. The mushroom trail ultimately became a battle between 2 competing narratives. The prosecution painted a picture of careful research, systematic harvesting, and deliberate preparation of deadly fungi for use as weapons against family members. The defense offered an alternative story of tragic accident, where an experienced forager inadvertently mixed deadly and edible varieties with catastrophic results. The scientific evidence could support either interpretation, leaving the jury to decide which explanation was more consistent with the broader pattern of evidence and more credible given the specific circumstances of the case. The mushroom trail had provided crucial technical information about the murder weapon, but it could not definitively resolve the question of intent that lay at the heart of the charges against ERIN Patterson. The peaceful morning of November 2nd, 2023, shattered the uneasy calm that had settled over Leongatha in the months following the mushroom poisoning deaths. At precisely 7 a.m., unmarked police vehicles converged on Dean Avenue as Detective Inspector Dean Thomas prepared to make one of the most significant arrests in Victoria's criminal history. ERIN Patterson was in her kitchen preparing breakfast for her children when the knock came at her front door. The 49-year-old mother had been living under intense scrutiny for months, aware that every move she made was being watched by investigators, media, and community members who had already formed their own opinions about her guilt or innocence. The arrest was conducted with professional courtesy but unmistakable authority. ERIN Patterson, you are under arrest for the murder of Donald Patterson, Gail Patterson, and Heather Wilkinson, and the attempted murder of Ian Wilkinson, Detective Inspector Thomas announced as he read her rights under Australian law. The charges were devastating in their scope and implications. 3 counts of murder carried potential sentences of life imprisonment without parole. The attempted murder charge relating to Ian Wilkinson's survival could add additional decades to any sentence. If convicted on all counts, ERIN Patterson would likely spend the rest of her life behind bars. The arrest marked the culmination of months of painstaking investigation by Victoria Police's homicide squad, working in collaboration with forensic specialists, toxicologists, digital evidence experts, and prosecutors from the Office of Public Prosecutions. Every aspect of ERIN's life in the months leading up to the fatal lunch had been scrutinized for evidence of planning, motive, and intent. Community reaction to the arrest was immediate and intense. Leongatha, with its population of barely 4,000 residents, had been living with the horror of the mushroom poisoning deaths for nearly 4 months. The rural farming community had struggled to understand how a family lunch could turn into a triple homicide, and many residents had already concluded that ERIN must be responsible. But the arrest also divided opinion along lines that reflected deeper questions about justice, evidence, and the presumption of innocence. Some community members felt vindicated by the charges, believing they confirmed what they had suspected all along. Others worried that ERIN was being made a scapegoat for a tragic accident that had spiraled out of control due to media attention and public pressure for answers. The media coverage of the arrest was extensive and immediate. News crews that had been monitoring the case for months descended on Leongatha, broadcasting live reports from outside ERIN's home and the police station where she was being processed. The case had already attracted national attention, but the formal charges elevated it to international news status. Headlines around Australia proclaimed variations of mushroom murder mum arrested and death cap killer charged. The coverage often focused on the unusual nature of the alleged crime, poisoning family members with wild mushrooms during what was supposed to be a reconciliation lunch. The combination of family betrayal, exotic poison, and rural setting created a narrative that captured public imagination. For ERIN's children, the arrest represented another devastating blow in a year that had already destroyed their family structure. Their grandparents were dead, their father was estranged from their mother, and now their primary caregiver was facing life imprisonment for crimes they could barely comprehend. Child Protection Services immediately became involved to ensure the children's welfare and safety. The legal proceedings moved swiftly after the arrest. ERIN was transported to Melbourne for her first court appearance, where she faced Magistrate Simon Zebrowski in a crowded courtroom filled with media representatives, family members of the victims, and curious observers. She appeared calm but subdued, speaking only to confirm her name and acknowledge that she understood the charges against her. Her legal representation was provided by Colin Mandy SC, one of Victoria's most experienced criminal defence barristers. Mandy had built his reputation defending complex cases involving serious charges, and he recognized immediately that this case would present unique challenges. The circumstantial nature of much of the evidence, combined with intense public interest and emotional testimony from survivors, would require careful strategy and meticulous preparation. The prosecution team was led by Nanette Rogers SC, equally experienced in major criminal trials and known for her methodical approach to complex cases. Rogers understood that proving murder in a circumstantial case required building an overwhelming pattern of evidence that excluded reasonable doubt about the defendant's intentions. The bail hearing became the first public preview of the competing narratives that would define the trial. The prosecution argued that ERIN posed a significant risk to community safety and had demonstrated sophisticated planning in allegedly obtaining and using deadly mushrooms as weapons. They pointed to the destruction of evidence through phone resets and dehydrator disposal as indicators that she might attempt to flee or interfere with witnesses. The defense countered that ERIN had cooperated fully with the investigation, had strong ties to the community through her children and employment, and posed no flight risk. They argued that the charges were based on speculation rather than solid evidence, and that their client deserved the presumption of innocence that formed the foundation of the Australian legal system. Magistrate Zebrowski ultimately granted bail under strict conditions. ERIN was required to surrender her passport, report regularly to police, remain within Victoria, and have no contact with prosecution witnesses. The bail amount was set at $100,000, a significant sum that reflected the seriousness of the charges, while acknowledging the lack of direct evidence proving flight risk. The months between arrest and trial became a period of intense preparation for both prosecution and defense teams. The circumstantial nature of the case meant that every piece of evidence would need to be carefully analyzed and presented in ways that supported each side's theory of what had happened during the fatal lunch. For the prosecution, the challenge was weaving together digital evidence, cell phone data, witness testimony, and expert opinions into a compelling narrative of premeditated murder. They needed to convince a jury that the combination of internet searches, location visits, equipment purchases, and subsequent lies could only be explained by deliberate intent to kill. The defense faced the equally daunting task of providing alternative explanations for each piece of circumstantial evidence while maintaining their client's innocence. They needed to show that grieving people make poor decisions under stress, that coincidences do occur, and that tragic accidents can create patterns that appear suspicious in hindsight. The case also raised broader questions about the nature of evidence in the digital age. Cell phone data, internet search histories, and deleted communications had become standard elements of criminal investigations, but their interpretation often required speculation about intent and state of mind that went beyond the technical facts themselves. Public opinion continued to evolve as more details emerged through pre-trial proceedings. Some observers remained convinced of ERIN's guilt, pointing to what they saw as too many coincidences to be explained by accident. Others questioned whether the evidence truly proved murder beyond reasonable doubt, especially given the lack of direct witnesses or physical evidence showing deliberate poisoning. The victims' families faced their own complex emotions as the case progressed through the legal system. While they wanted justice for their lost loved ones, they also recognized that no trial outcome could bring back Don, Gail, and Heather, or repair the family relationships that had been destroyed by suspicion and grief. Ian Wilkinson, the sole survivor, found himself in the particularly difficult position of being both a victim and a key witness. His recovery from near-fatal poisoning had been nothing short of miraculous, but he now faced the prospect of testifying against someone he had once considered family. His survival story would become central to both prosecution and defense strategies. As the case moved toward trial, the community of Leongatha struggled to heal from the trauma that had fractured their sense of safety and trust. The small farming town had become synonymous with one of Australia's most notorious alleged crimes, association that would likely persist long after the legal proceedings concluded. The arrest and charges represented a pivotal moment in a case that had already changed multiple lives forever. 3 people were dead, 1 had survived against impossible odds, a woman faced life imprisonment, children had lost their family structure, and an entire community had been forced to confront the possibility that evil could hide behind the facade of family hospitality. The stage was now set for a trial that would test every aspect of Australia's criminal justice system while attempting to answer the fundamental question that had haunted everyone involved. Was this premeditated murder, disguised as family concern, or a tragic accident compounded by panic, poor judgment, and the natural human tendency to make bad decisions under extreme stress? The Latrobe Valley Law Courts in Morwell had never hosted a case quite like this one. The regional courthouse, typically handling routine matters for the farming communities of central Victoria, found itself at the centre of national attention as ERIN Patterson's triple murder trial began on April 14, 2025. Justice Christopher Beale, with decades of experience in complex criminal cases, would preside over proceedings that would test the limits of circumstantial evidence and challenge fundamental assumptions about family, trust, and the nature of proof. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Nanette Rogers SC, painted a chilling portrait of calculated murder disguised as family hospitality. Standing before the jury of 12 ordinary Victorians, Rogers methodically outlined her theory that ERIN Patterson had researched, harvested, and prepared death cap mushrooms specifically to kill her estranged husband's family members during what appeared to be a reconciliation lunch. This was not a tragic accident, Rogers told the attentive jurors. This was premeditated murder carried out with sophisticated planning and ruthless execution. The defendant used one of nature's most perfect poisons to destroy people who trusted her enough to accept an invitation to lunch in her home. The defense response, crafted by Colin Mandy SC, offered a dramatically different interpretation of the same events. Mandy acknowledged the tragedy that had befallen the Patterson and Wilkinson families, but argued that grief and coincidence had been twisted into accusations of murder against an innocent woman who was herself a victim of circumstances beyond her control. What happened on July 29, 2023, was indeed a tragedy, Mandy told the jury, but it was a terrible accident, not murder. My client is guilty of poor judgment, panic, and making bad decisions under extreme stress, but she is not guilty of deliberately poisoning the people she was trying to welcome back into her family circle. The first major witness would set the tone for the entire trial and provide the most emotionally powerful testimony the jury would hear. Ian Wilkinson, the 71-year-old pastor who had survived death cap mushroom poisoning through what doctors called miraculous circumstances, entered the courtroom with obvious physical difficulty, but unmistakable moral authority. Wilkinson's testimony about the events of July 29th began with his surprise at receiving ERIN's lunch invitation. He described their relationship as friendly and amicable, but acknowledged that he considered her more of an acquaintance than a close friend. The COVID pandemic had actually brought them closer together, when ERIN had helped broadcast his church services online, and she occasionally attended his sermons. I was very happy to accept the invitation, Wilkinson testified, his voice still showing traces of the physical damage caused by his poisoning ordeal. We didn't really understand why we'd been invited, but it became clear during the meal when ERIN made her announcement about having cancer. The revelation about ERIN's fabricated cancer diagnosis created one of the most dramatic moments of the trial. Wilkinson described how the lunch guests had immediately rallied around her, offering advice and support for what they believed was a life-threatening medical crisis. His own response, as a pastor, had been to suggest prayer and honest communication with her children. "I prayed a prayer asking God's blessing on ERIN, that she would get the treatment she needed, that the kids would be okay, that she would have wisdom in how she told the kids," Wilkinson recalled. The irony of praying for someone who may have just poisoned him was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. Under cross-examination, Mandy handled Wilkinson with obvious respect for his suffering, while gently probing for details that might support the defense theory of accidental poisoning. Wilkinson acknowledged that the meal had been enjoyable, the conversation pleasant, and ERIN's demeanor that of someone genuinely concerned about a medical issue rather than someone who had just committed murder. But it was Wilkinson's account of his subsequent medical ordeal that provided the most compelling testimony about the nature of death cap mushroom poisoning. His description of the onset of symptoms, the rapid deterioration of his condition, and his weeks in intensive care gave the jury a visceral understanding of what the three victims had endured before their deaths. "By Sunday morning, I could barely keep any fluids down," Wilkinson testified. "My wife and I were both getting sicker by the hour. We knew something was terribly wrong, but we had no idea we were fighting for our lives." His survival story became one of the most powerful elements of the prosecution case. While Don, Gail, and Heather had succumbed to organ failure despite receiving identical treatment, Ian had somehow marshaled the strength to survive weeks on life support and months of recovery. His presence in the courtroom served as a living reminder of what the other victims had endured. The medical testimony that followed Wilkinson's account provided scientific context for the horror he had described. Dr. Stephen Warrillow, the intensive care specialist who had treated all four victims, explained in clinical detail how death cap mushroom toxins attack the human body at the cellular level. The amatoxins inhibit RNA polymerase, effectively stopping protein synthesis in liver cells, Warrillow testified. The cells begin dying en masse, and the body's natural detoxification processes actually recycle the toxins, causing additional damage throughout the liver and kidneys. Warrillow's explanation of why some victims survive while others die from identical poisoning helped the jury understand why Ian had lived while the others had died. Factors including age, weight, overall health, and the specific amount of toxin consumed could all influence outcomes in ways that were impossible to predict or control. The doctor's testimony also addressed one of the key prosecution arguments, that ERIN's medical presentation after the lunch was inconsistent with death cap mushroom poisoning. While her guests were suffering massive organ failure, ERIN appeared relatively well to medical staff and was reluctant to remain in the hospital for treatment. Her symptoms and presentation were not consistent with the severe poisoning we were seeing in the other four patients, Warrillow testified. Someone who had consumed the same amount of toxins would typically show similar signs of distress and organ dysfunction. The defense challenged this medical opinion by presenting expert testimony suggesting that individual responses to death cap mushroom poisoning could vary dramatically based on numerous factors. They argued that ERIN's younger age, larger body mass, and potentially different consumption patterns could explain why her symptoms were less severe. The digital forensics testimony proved to be among the most technical and contentious evidence presented during the trial. Detective Senior Constable Bradley Fox Henry spent 2 days explaining his analysis of devices seized from ERIN's home, walking the jury through complex concepts of data recovery, cell phone tower connections, and internet search histories. Fox Henry's testimony about the factory resets performed on ERIN's secondary phone created some of the most dramatic moments of the trial. The precise timing of these data destructions, particularly the reset performed while the device was in police custody, suggested either deliberate evidence tampering or sophisticated security protocols that automatically deleted sensitive information. The prosecution argued that these resets showed consciousness of guilt, demonstrating ERIN's awareness that her devices contained incriminating evidence. The defense countered that modern smartphones regularly perform automatic updates and security functions that can trigger factory resets, especially when passwords are forgotten or devices are handled by unfamiliar users. More damaging to the defense was Fox Henry's testimony about internet search histories showing visits to the iNaturalist website, particularly searches related to death cap mushroom sightings in Victoria. The correlation between these searches and cell phone data placing ERIN near mushroom locations became a cornerstone of the prosecution argument for premeditation. Under intense cross-examination, the defense challenged Fox Henry's qualifications and methodology. They revealed that he had not held some relevant certifications when he first examined ERIN's devices and had relied heavily on guidance from more experienced colleagues. They also questioned the precision of cell tower data in rural areas, arguing that connections to distant towers were common and could not prove someone had actually visited specific locations. The mycology testimony provided crucial scientific background for understanding the prosecution's theory of how the poisoning had been carried out. Expert witness Tom May explained the growth patterns, seasonal availability, and habitat preferences of deathcap mushrooms in Victoria, helping the jury understand how someone might locate and harvest these deadly fungi. May's testimony about his own iNaturalist postings documenting mushroom locations became particularly significant when combined with the digital evidence, suggesting ERIN had accessed these postings and visited the same areas shortly afterward. The prosecution argued that this showed deliberate research and planning, while the defense maintained it represented innocent coincidence. Christine Mackenzie, the retired poison information specialist, who had posted the Loch mushroom sighting, testified with obvious regret about her role in potentially providing information that could have been used for harmful purposes. Her intention had been to warn the public about dangerous fungi in a popular recreation area, but the prosecution argued that her detailed GPS coordinates had instead provided a treasure map for someone seeking deadly mushrooms. The toxicology evidence presented by prosecution experts explained why deathcap mushrooms were particularly suitable as murder weapons. The delayed onset of symptoms, the inability of cooking or drying to neutralize the toxins, and the high fatality rate made them nearly perfect for someone seeking to poison others while avoiding immediate detection. But perhaps the most anticipated testimony came from ERIN Patterson herself. Over 8 days on the witness stand, she would face intense questioning from both prosecution and defense attorneys, while the entire nation watched for signs of guilt or innocence in her demeanor and responses. ERIN's direct examination by her defense counsel began with her background and family situation. She described herself as a devoted mother who had struggled with weight issues and eating disorders since childhood. Her relationship with Simon had deteriorated over financial stress and disagreements about their children's education, but she maintained that she had never wanted to harm his family members. Her account of the July 29th lunch began with her disappointment at Simon's last-minute withdrawal from the gathering. She had planned the meal specifically as a reconciliation gesture, choosing beef Wellington because she remembered her mother preparing it for special occasions. The mushroom duxelles had been prepared from what she claimed were store-bought button mushrooms combined with dried mushrooms from an Asian grocery store. Under cross-examination, prosecutor Nanette Rogers methodically challenged every aspect of ERIN's account. The inconsistencies in her story about where she had purchased the dried mushrooms became a focal point, with Rogers arguing that her detailed memory of other shopping activities made her claimed forgetfulness about the mushroom source unbelievable. You can remember the exact conversations you had with medical staff, the specific times you called various people, and detailed descriptions of other purchases you made, Rogers stated, but you cannot remember which store sold you the ingredients that killed 3 people. Does that seem reasonable to you? ERIN's response, that stress and trauma had affected her memory of some events while leaving others clear, became emblematic of the broader credibility battle that would define the trial. The prosecution argued that her selective memory was evidence of deliberate deception, while the defense maintained that human memory is fallible and unreliable under extreme stress. The cancer fabrication proved to be one of the most damaging elements of ERIN's testimony. Her admission that she had never been diagnosed with cancer, but had allowed her guests to believe she faced a life-threatening illness, created obvious credibility problems that extended to other aspects of her account. Rogers pressed this advantage relentlessly. I suggest that you never thought you would have to account for this lie about having cancer because you thought that the lunch guests would die. ERIN's denial, that's not true, carried little conviction in the face of the obvious logic behind the prosecution's theory. If she had indeed planned to poison her guests, fabricating a cancer diagnosis would provide cover for her emotional state, while also ensuring they would not question her motives for the lunch invitation. The prosecution's theory gained additional support from ERIN's behavior after the lunch. Her reluctance to seek medical treatment despite claiming to have consumed the same meal that was killing her guests suggested awareness that she was not actually at risk. Her decision to dispose of the food dehydrator and reset her phone just days after the deaths indicated consciousness of guilt rather than grief-stricken confusion. But the defense managed to score points by highlighting the prosecution's inability to find physical evidence of deathcap mushrooms in ERIN's possession. The absence of the actual murder weapon combined with the failure to locate the Asian grocery store where she claimed to have purchased dried mushrooms, left room for reasonable doubt about whether she had actually obtained or used deadly fungi. Mandy also emphasized the lack of clear motive for the alleged murders. While marital breakdown often creates family tensions, there was no evidence that ERIN stood to gain financially from the deaths of her in-laws, or that she harbored specific grudges against the individual victims. The prosecution's argument that she had been feeling excluded from family gatherings seemed insufficient to explain such an extreme response. The emotional impact of the trial extended far beyond the courtroom. Family members of the victims attended daily proceedings, seeking answers and justice for their lost loved ones. The community of Leongatha remained divided between those convinced of ERIN's guilt and others who believed she was being unfairly prosecuted for a tragic accident. Media coverage of the trial was extensive and detailed, with daily reports broadcast across Australia and internationally. The unusual nature of the alleged crime, combined with the compelling personalities involved, created a narrative that captured public attention in ways that more conventional murder cases might not. As the prosecution and defense prepared their closing arguments, both sides recognized that they were asking the jury to make a determination that would resonate far beyond this individual case. The verdict would send a message about the standard of evidence required for conviction in circumstantial cases, and about society's willingness to believe that family members could use exotic poisons to murder people who trusted them. The trial had revealed the complexity of modern criminal investigation, where digital evidence, scientific testimony, and psychological analysis must be combined to reconstruct events that left no direct witnesses. It had also demonstrated the challenges facing the justice system when dealing with crimes that exploit the trust and intimacy of family relationships. Whether ERIN Patterson was a calculating killer who had used death cap mushrooms to commit perfect murders, or a grieving woman whose poor decisions under stress had been misinterpreted as evidence of guilt, would soon be determined by 12 ordinary citizens tasked with one of the most difficult decisions any jury could face. The atmosphere in the Latrobe Valley Law Courts was electric with anticipation as Justice Christopher Beale prepared to deliver his final instructions to the jury on June 24, 2025. After 8 weeks of testimony, expert evidence, and emotional revelations, the most closely watched criminal trial in Australian history was entering its final phase. The judge's directions would prove to be the dramatic turning point that gave this case its ultimate significance, not just for the outcome of ERIN Patterson's fate, but for how the Australian legal system handles complex circumstantial evidence cases in the digital age. Justice Beale, with his decades of experience in major criminal trials, understood the weight of this moment. 12 ordinary Victorians would soon be tasked with determining whether the evidence proved beyond reasonable doubt that a suburban mother had used death cap mushrooms to murder 3 family members. The decision would resonate through Australian legal history and influence how similar cases were prosecuted and defended for years to come. The judge began his instructions with a comprehensive review of the legal principles that would guide the jury's deliberations. His explanation of circumstantial evidence became particularly crucial, given that the prosecution case relied entirely on inference and interpretation rather than direct witness testimony to the alleged crimes. Circumstantial evidence is evidence of facts which, taken together, may lead you to conclude that the accused is guilty of the offence charged, Justice Beale explained to the attentive jurors. However, before you can find the accused guilty on circumstantial evidence, you must be satisfied not only that the circumstances are consistent with her having committed the offence, but also that the facts proved are such as to be inconsistent with any reasonable hypothesis other than the guilt of the accused. This instruction highlighted the fundamental challenge facing the prosecution. They needed to prove not just that the evidence was consistent with ERIN's guilt, but that it excluded all other reasonable explanations for the events of July 29, 2023, and the behavior that followed. But it was Justice Beale's detailed discussion of what prosecutors called incriminating conduct that created the most dramatic moments of his instructions. The judge methodically outlined the alleged lies, destroyed evidence, and suspicious behavior that formed the backbone of the prosecution case, while simultaneously warning the jury about the dangers of inferring guilt from lies alone. The prosecution had argued that ERIN's pattern of deception demonstrated consciousness of guilt. They pointed to her false claim about having cancer, her inconsistent accounts of where she had purchased mushrooms, her disposal of the food dehydrator, her factory resets of her mobile phone, and her misleading statements to police during the investigation. Justice Beale acknowledged these allegations while providing crucial legal context. The prosecution argues that these lies and actions constitute incriminating conduct that implies an admission of guilt. However, I must warn you that people lie for many reasons, and the mere fact that someone has lied does not necessarily mean they are guilty of the offense charged. This warning represented a critical moment in the trial. The judge was essentially telling the jury that while they could consider ERIN's admitted lies as evidence affecting her credibility, they could not convict her based solely on the fact that she had been dishonest. They needed to find that her lies and actions could only be reasonably explained by guilt of the specific charges she faced. The judge then provided detailed analysis of each alleged instance of incriminating conduct, presenting both prosecution and defense interpretations to help the jury understand the competing theories of the case. Regarding ERIN's medical presentation after the lunch, Justice Beale summarized the prosecution argument that her relatively mild symptoms and reluctance to receive treatment showed she knew she had not consumed death cap mushrooms because she had deliberately avoided poisoning herself while serving contaminated food to her guests. The defense counter-argument, the judge explained, was that ERIN's behavior could be explained by her history of leaving hospitals against medical advice, her distrust of medical professionals following a previous misdiagnosis, and her need to make arrangements for her children and animals at home. The phone evidence received particularly detailed attention in the judge's instructions. He explained the technical aspects of factory resets and their timing, noting that multiple resets had occurred in the days immediately following the deaths, including one while the device was in police custody. The prosecution argues that these resets show consciousness of guilt, that the accused was attempting to destroy evidence of her planning and intentions. Justice Beale told the jury. The defense argues that modern smartphones often perform automatic security functions that can appear suspicious but actually result from forgotten passwords, software updates, or unfamiliarity with device operations. The judge's treatment of the digital evidence highlighted one of the most significant aspects of modern criminal trials. Electronic devices now generate massive amounts of data about user behavior, location, and activities, but interpreting this data requires making inferences about intent and state of mind that go beyond the technical facts themselves. Justice Beale's instructions on the mushroom sourcing allegations created another pivotal moment in his directions. He outlined the prosecution's argument that ERIN's story about purchasing dried mushrooms from an Asian grocery store was fabricated to hide her actual foraging activities guided by iNaturalist website postings. The judge noted the prosecution's emphasis on ERIN's changing accounts of where she had shopped, mentioning Oakley, Glen Waverley, and Mount Waverley at different times, and their argument that her detailed memory of other events made her claimed forgetfulness about the mushroom source unbelievable. The defense response, according to the judge's summary, was that human memory is fallible under stress, that the prosecution had cherry-picked inconsistencies while ignoring areas where ERIN's account remained consistent, and that investigators had failed to adequately search Asian grocery stores in the areas she had mentioned. Perhaps the most crucial element of Justice Beale's instructions was his warning about the standard of proof required for conviction. He emphasized repeatedly that the prosecution must prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, not just beyond some doubt or on the balance of probabilities. Proof beyond reasonable doubt is proof that satisfies you that the accused is guilty, the judge explained. It is not proof beyond all possible doubt, nor is it proof beyond a shadow of a doubt. However, if after considering all the evidence you have a reasonable doubt about the accused's guilt, you must find her not guilty. This instruction was particularly significant given the circumstantial nature of the prosecution case. While the evidence created a pattern that was consistent with guilt, the question for the jury was whether it excluded all other reasonable explanations for the tragic events that had unfolded. The judge's discussion of expert evidence provided another crucial element of his instructions. He reminded the jury that they were not required to accept the opinions of forensic specialists, medical experts, or digital analysis professionals, but should consider their qualifications, experience, and the basis for their conclusions. This guidance was particularly relevant to the digital forensics evidence that had formed such a significant part of the prosecution case. Justice Beale noted that the defense had challenged the qualifications and methodology of some expert witnesses, and that the jury should consider these challenges when weighing the reliability of technical evidence. The judge's treatment of motive, or the lack thereof, also created significant discussion. He noted that the prosecution was not required to prove motive for the alleged murders, but that the absence of clear motive was a factor the jury could consider when evaluating the overall strength of the case. The prosecution had suggested that ERIN felt excluded from family gatherings and was facing financial pressures related to her divorce, But these factors seemed insufficient to explain such extreme actions against people she had invited to lunch in her own home. Justice Beale's instructions on the cancer fabrication proved to be among the most damaging elements for the defense. He noted that ERIN had admitted lying about having cancer, but had provided an explanation related to her embarrassment about potential gastric bypass surgery and her eating disorder. The prosecution theory, the judge explained, was that she had never expected to have to account for this lie because she believed the lunch guests would die from the poisoning. The defense maintained that the lie reflected her psychological struggles with weight and medical issues rather than evidence of murderous intent. As Justice Beale continued his comprehensive review of the evidence and legal principles, it became clear that his instructions were creating a roadmap for the jury's deliberations that would influence how they weighed each piece of evidence against the others. The judge's warning about the dangers of speculation proved particularly significant. He emphasized that while the jury could draw reasonable inferences from proven facts, they could not convict based on speculation, suspicion, or assumptions about what might have happened. You must be satisfied that the only reasonable inference from the proven facts is that the accused is guilty of the charges, Justice Beale stated. If there are other reasonable explanations for the evidence consistent with innocence, you must find the accused not guilty. This instruction highlighted the fundamental challenge facing the prosecution in any circumstantial case. They had assembled a compelling pattern of suspicious behavior, lies, and coincidences, but the question remained whether this pattern excluded all reasonable doubt about ERIN's innocence. The emotional weight of the judge's instructions was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. Family members of the victims sat quietly, understanding that these technical legal discussions would ultimately determine whether they received the justice they sought for their lost loved ones. ERIN Patterson herself appeared calm but tense as she listened to the judge's analysis of the evidence against her. After months of proceedings, her fate now rested with 12 strangers who would need to decide whether the prosecution had met the demanding standard required for criminal conviction. As Justice Beale concluded his initial instructions and prepared to continue with additional legal guidance, the dramatic nature of this turning point became clear. The judge had effectively laid out the prosecution and defense theories in their strongest forms, while providing the legal framework the jury would use to evaluate them. The instructions had revealed both the strength and weaknesses of the circumstantial case against ERIN Patterson. While the prosecution had assembled an impressive array of evidence suggesting guilt, the defense had provided alternative explanations for virtually every suspicious element that created reasonable doubt about the ultimate question of intent. The jury would now face one of the most difficult decisions any group of citizens could be asked to make, determining whether a suburban mother had used exotic mushrooms to murder family members who trusted her, or whether a tragic accident had been transformed into murder charges through a combination of grief, speculation, and the natural human desire to find someone to blame for inexplicable tragedy. As Justice Christopher Beale concluded his final instructions to the jury on Monday, June 30, 2025, and the 12 men and women filed out to begin their deliberations, Australia held its collective breath. The ERIN Patterson case had become more than just a criminal trial. It had evolved into a national conversation about family, trust, evidence, and the nature of justice in the modern age. The case that began with a family lunch intended to heal relationships had exposed fundamental questions about how well we truly know the people closest to us. 3 people were dead, 1 had survived against impossible odds, and a woman faced spending the rest of her life in prison for crimes she maintained she did not commit. But regardless of the jury's ultimate verdict, the case had already provided profound lessons about resilience, survival, and the power of human determination in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. Ian Wilkinson's survival story stands as the most inspiring element of this tragic case. The 71-year-old pastor who had offered a prayer of blessing over someone who may have just poisoned him demonstrated that faith, medical expertise, and sheer determination can overcome even the deadliest toxins. His weeks in intensive care, fighting for his life while his wife and friends succumbed to the same poison, showed that miracles can occur even in the darkest circumstances. Wilkinson's testimony during the trial revealed not just the physical ordeal he had endured, but the emotional strength required to survive losing his beloved wife while testifying against someone he had once considered family. His grace under unimaginable pressure provided a model for how people can maintain dignity and compassion even when faced with betrayal and loss. The medical professionals who treated all 4 victims also demonstrated extraordinary dedication and skill. Dr. Stephen Warrilow and his team at Austin Hospital fought tirelessly to save lives using every resource available to modern medicine. While they could not save Don, Gail, and Heather, their successful treatment of Ian proved that even the most dire situations can have hopeful outcomes when expertise meets determination. The case also highlighted the importance of community support during crisis. The farming communities of South Gippsland rallied around the affected families, providing practical assistance and emotional support during their darkest hours. This response showed how small communities can demonstrate the best of human nature when faced with tragedy that touches everyone. For law enforcement and the legal system, the case provided important lessons about investigating complex crimes in the digital age. The combination of traditional detective work with modern forensic techniques, digital analysis, and expert testimony created a comprehensive approach to solving crimes that leave no direct witnesses. Detective Inspector Dean Thomas and his team showed how patient, methodical investigation could assemble compelling cases from circumstantial evidence. Their work demonstrated that modern criminals cannot rely on the absence of witnesses to escape justice. Digital footprints, communication patterns, and behavioral analysis can provide evidence that is often more reliable than human testimony. The forensic specialists who analyzed electronic devices, cell phone data, and internet search histories revealed how technology has transformed criminal investigation. Every online search, location ping, and deleted file can become evidence in ways that would have been impossible just a generation ago. But the case also showed the limitations of digital evidence and the dangers of inferring too much from electronic data. The defense challenges to expert testimony and methodology highlighted the need for rigorous standards when technical evidence is used to prove criminal intent. The legal proceedings themselves provided valuable insights into how the justice system handles complex circumstantial cases. Justice Christopher Beale's careful instructions to the jury demonstrated the high standard of proof required for criminal conviction and the safeguards built into the system to protect innocent defendants. The prosecution and defense strategies showed how skilled advocates can present dramatically different interpretations of the same evidence. Nanette Rogers' methodical presentation of the case for premeditated murder and Colin Mandy's alternative theory of tragic accident illustrated the adversarial system's ability to test evidence from multiple perspectives. The extensive media coverage of the case raised important questions about the balance between public interest and fair trial rights. While the community had legitimate concerns about safety and justice, the intense scrutiny also created pressures that could influence witnesses, jurors, and participants in ways that might compromise the integrity of the proceedings. For families dealing with tragedy and loss, the case provided both cautionary tales and sources of hope. The destruction of family relationships through suspicion and legal proceedings showed how quickly trust can be shattered when tragedy strikes. But the dignity displayed by victim family members and Ian Wilkinson's remarkable recovery demonstrated that healing and forgiveness remain possible even after the most devastating experiences. The case also revealed the complexity of family dynamics and the hidden pressures that can exist beneath the surface of seemingly normal relationships. The tensions between ERIN and Simon Patterson, the difficulties of maintaining extended family connections during marital breakdown, and the challenges of single parenthood all contributed to the circumstances that led to the fatal lunch. These family dynamics reminded observers that domestic relationships often involve complicated emotions, competing loyalties, and unresolved conflicts that can escalate in unexpected ways. The importance of communication, professional counseling, and family support systems became clear as the details of the Patterson family situation emerged. For the broader community, the case highlighted the need for awareness about natural dangers that exist in the environment. Deathcap mushrooms continue to grow in parks and forests throughout Victoria, posing ongoing risks to curious children, pets, and inexperienced foragers. Christine Mackenzie's public warnings about mushroom locations, which may have inadvertently provided information used for harmful purposes, showed both the benefits and risks of citizen science initiatives. The case also demonstrated the importance of accurate information about wild mushrooms and the dangers of casual foraging without expert knowledge. Educational programs about mushroom identification and the risks of consuming unknown fungi could prevent future tragedies, whether accidental or intentional. As Australia awaited the jury's verdict, the case had already influenced discussions about criminal law reform, evidence standards, and the prosecution of complex crimes. Legal experts debated whether current standards of proof were adequate for cases involving sophisticated planning and digital evidence, and whether new approaches might be needed for crimes that exploit modern technology and scientific knowledge. The international attention the case received also highlighted Australia's legal system and investigative capabilities to a global audience. The professional conduct of all participants, from police investigators to legal advocates to court officials, demonstrated the country's commitment to due process and thorough justice proceedings. But perhaps the most important lesson from the ERIN Patterson case was about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unthinkable circumstances. Ian Wilkinson's survival against impossible odds, the dignity of grieving family members, the dedication of medical professionals, and the patience of investigators all showed that good can emerge from even the darkest situations. Whether ERIN Patterson was ultimately found guilty or innocent, the case had already provided evidence that people can survive devastating challenges, that communities can support each other through crisis, and that the justice system can carefully examine complex evidence while protecting the rights of all participants. The families affected by this tragedy, whether victims or accused, would continue their healing processes long after the legal proceedings concluded. The community of Leongatha would eventually move beyond its association with this notorious case. The lessons learned about family relationships, trust, evidence, and survival would influence how similar situations were handled in the future. As we reflect on this extraordinary case, we are reminded that life can change dramatically in a single moment, that the people we trust most can sometimes hurt us most deeply, but that human resilience and the pursuit of justice can provide hope even in the darkest circumstances. The story of the fatal lunch on July 29, 2023, will be remembered as one of Australia's most complex criminal cases, but it should also be remembered as a testament to the survival spirit of Ian Wilkinson, the dedication of medical professionals who fought to save lives, the patience of investigators who sought truth through painstaking analysis, and the courage of family members who sought justice while maintaining their dignity through unimaginable loss. Whether this case represents justice served or a tragic misunderstanding of innocent behavior under stress, it has provided valuable lessons about the complexity of human relationships, the power of forensic science, and the importance of maintaining faith in both human goodness and the pursuit of truth. If you found this case as compelling and thought-provoking as we did, make sure to subscribe to Criminal Mind Cortex for more incredible true crime investigations that explore the intersection of family, justice, and human survival. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest deep examinations into cases that reveal both the darkest and most inspiring aspects of human nature. Share this with someone who appreciates stories of remarkable survival and the relentless pursuit of truth, because these real-life cases remind us that even in our darkest moments, hope and justice can still prevail.